If you walk through the marble corridors of Washington this week, you won't hear the familiar urgency of a political system in campaign mode. There is no sense of acceleration, no visible scramble. What analysts describe instead is something far more deliberate, a controlled quiet that tends to emerge when institutions stop campaigning and start calculating. This is not the silence of stability. It is the silence of reassessment. Veteran observers of American power note that this kind of atmosphere typically appears when political leadership and institutional priorities begin to diverge, when the system no longer assumes alignment and instead begins preparing for multiple outcomes at once. On the surface, public attention remains fixed on the rituals of politics, rallies, speeches, polling headlines tied to the 2026 midterm cycle. These signals dominate social media and cable news. They create the impression of motion, conflict, and momentum. But beneath that surface, a quieter recalibration appears to be underway. According to political strategists and institutional analysts, there is growing tension between the symbolic authority of the executive branch and the risk management instincts of the Republican Party's institutional infrastructure. This is not open confrontation. It is not rebellion. It is something far more subtle, a gradual repositioning. At the same time, developments far from Washington are being monitored with unusual interest. Shifts in national approval trends related to President Trump, combined with renewed attention on Tom Steyer's political ambitions in California, are increasingly interpreted as part of a broader realignment in how political and economic power is organized inside the United States. This analysis is not about individual personalities. It is not about daily polling swings. It is about how institutions historically behave when confidence in economic stewardship weakens, and when alternative centers of influence begin preparing for greater autonomy. What the public often sees are isolated events. What institutions monitor are patterns. Public-facing political coverage tends to frame approval ratings as temporary obstacles. Recent national surveys from major polling organizations place presidential approval in the mid-40s, while separate economic surveys indicate that a majority of Americans express concern about inflation, consumer costs, and long-term financial security. These figures are often presented as cyclical, challenges that can be overcome through messaging, legislative announcements, or targeted executive actions. In this framework, politics is treated as performance, a sequence of tactical moves where momentum can always be recovered. Inside institutional circles, however, the interpretation is more restrained. Analysts focused on long-term political and financial risk place far less emphasis on raw approval numbers and far more emphasis on something less visible: the durability of the administration's economic credibility. In previous cycles, economic confidence acted as a stabilizing force even during periods of intense polarization. Voters might disagree culturally or politically, but belief in economic competence provided institutional breathing room. When that belief begins to weaken, particularly when trade policy, tariffs, or inflation are increasingly cited by voters as direct personal stressors, planning assumptions begin to change. According to multiple political observers, Republican leadership is not reacting out of concern for one individual's political standing. They are reacting to what those numbers imply for congressional control, budget authority, and long-term party viability. This stage is often described internally as strategic anxiety. It is the moment when political organizations stop optimizing for a single outcome and begin hedging across several. Public discussion focuses on loyalty and rhetoric. Institutional behavior focuses on continuity and exposure. Rather than public dissent, early signals tend to appear in campaign finance decisions, shifts in donor emphasis, and the quiet reprioritization of districts once considered secure. These are not acts of defiance. They are acts of preparation. Analysts point out that this recalibration did not emerge from a single event. Instead, it reflects the accumulation of smaller signals over time. Reporting from Washington-based political journalists suggests that conversations among major donors and party strategists increasingly revolve around voter disengagement rather than ideological dissatisfaction. That distinction is critical. History shows that dissatisfied voters can be reactivated. Indifferent voters are far harder to mobilize. Market observers have also noted growing scrutiny of recent policy proposals emphasizing consumer protections, financial regulation, and targeted intervention in sectors such as housing and banking. While these proposals are often framed publicly as pro-worker or pro-consumer, traditional donor networks tend to view abrupt policy pivots as indicators of unpredictability. From an institutional perspective, the concern is not ideological alignment, it is policy volatility. Capital markets and large-scale financial systems prioritize consistency over messaging. When policy direction appears reactive rather than strategic, confidence erodes, regardless of political branding. This dynamic transcends party labels. It reflects a fundamental tension between short-term political signaling and long-term institutional stability. Against this backdrop, attention has increasingly shifted toward California. Tom Steyer, a prominent Democratic donor and activist frequently mentioned as a potential gubernatorial contender, represents a different axis of political organization. Analysts emphasize that his relevance is not rooted solely in ideology, but in structure. Steyer's political positioning combines progressive rhetoric with deep ties to financial and technological capital. This combination reflects California's evolving role as a semi-autonomous economic and political power center within the United States. California's economy alone rivals that of major nation-states. Policy decisions made at the state level, particularly in technology, energy, environmental regulation, and labor standards, increasingly shape national and global markets. From this perspective, Steyer's prominence reflects what some analysts describe as counter-capital mobilization, not resistance to federal authority, but consolidation within parallel governance structures. This is not opposition in the traditional sense. It is institution building. Within national security and defense institutions, publicly articulated priorities continue to emphasize operational continuity. Long-term planning related to global competition, supply chain security, and defense partnerships proceeds largely independent of short-term political turbulence. This reflects standard bureaucratic behavior rather than conspiracy. Institutions tasked with managing multi-decade strategies tend to insulate themselves from electoral cycles whenever possible. In Congress, leadership responses remain notably restrained. Rather than engaging directly with controversial economic proposals, many lawmakers have opted for strategic silence, allowing policy outcomes to define political responsibility while reinforcing local political defenses. Financial regulators, including the Federal Reserve and international banking authorities, continue advancing regulatory frameworks such as Basel III capital requirements. These measures are widely interpreted as efforts to reinforce systemic stability, regardless of political leadership. Across institutions, the pattern remains consistent: less responsiveness to short-term political signaling, more emphasis on structural insulation. Political power in the United States does not operate as a single hierarchy. It functions through overlapping systems: electoral, financial, military, and bureaucratic, each governed by different incentives and timelines. Recent years have intensified the tension between movement-driven political energy and institution-driven economic stability. Movements mobilize emotion, identity, and urgency. Institutions manage infrastructure, capital, and continuity. This tension becomes especially visible during periods of economic uncertainty. California's evolving political landscape illustrates this dynamic clearly. Progressive rhetoric focused on utility reform, environmental transition, and economic fairness often coexists with strong backing from venture capital and technology sectors. Analysts note that this does not represent a rejection of elite power. It represents a reconfiguration of it. When executive leadership, legislative priorities, and institutional incentives diverge, governance becomes increasingly constrained. Large-scale legislation grows more difficult. Administrative actions face prolonged legal challenges. Policy coherence weakens. Internationally, allies monitor domestic cohesion closely. Governments perceived as internally divided struggle to project long-term reliability, encouraging other nations to diversify strategic partnerships. Domestically, analysts identify erosion of public trust as the most significant long-term risk. When political language becomes disconnected from policy outcomes, ideological labels lose meaning. The result is often cynicism rather than engagement. History suggests that such periods rarely end abruptly. They tend to produce gradual institutional decay, systems that continue functioning while losing public legitimacy. Political historians frequently draw comparisons to transitional periods such as the mid-1970s, when economic stress and credibility gaps reshaped public confidence. Then, as now, official economic indicators conflicted with lived experience. Today, low unemployment figures coexist with persistent concerns about housing affordability, energy costs, and consumer prices. This disconnect fuels institutional recalibration rather than public reassurance. Such periods are often described as interregnums, moments when the old order weakens while the next has yet to fully emerge. What current developments suggest is not the collapse of individual political figures, but a broader recalibration of American power. Republican leadership responses to polling trends reflect systemic risk management rather than personal loyalty. In California, progressive-aligned capital seeks governance influence through institutional consolidation rather than protest. The defining contest of the coming years is unlikely to be framed purely as left versus right. Instead, it will unfold between competing elite strategies for managing economic uncertainty, political volatility, and public disengagement. As headlines shift and polls fluctuate, the most consequential movements often occur quietly. In funding decisions, regulatory frameworks, and long-term planning assumptions, power in the United States is becoming less performative and more structural, less visible, but more insulated. The question ahead is not simply who wins elections. It is whether American political institutions can restore public confidence in a system increasingly perceived as distant, cautious, and self-protective. That is the real signal beneath the noise. If this analysis helped you better understand the forces shaping American politics, subscribe to U.S. Power Report and share your perspective in the comments. Do you believe institutional power is adapting effectively to political volatility? Or is the disconnect growing too wide to manage? In our next report, we'll examine the quiet expansion of national security investment across the American heartland and what it signals for the future of U.S. industrial policy. Until then, stay focused not only on what is said, but on what remains carefully unsaid.